So, hope you're well, mate. We're going to start off with the quote and have a little look at your son's, well, the cheap classic army that he picked up second hand. Let's see what we can do with it. Let's have a look at the internals and let's sort of see what we can do with in regards to upgrades or whatever we want to do. I know you've said let's just give it a quick once over and make sure it's working, so we'll start with that. So first, let's just make sure there's no BBs in the barrel. Let's test it on a 7.4 LiPo. Excuse the audio, my mic's there, so I'm going to move this away. That sounds delicious. Anyway, I'm not even going to bother FPS testing this. I think it's going to need a bit of work. It sounds sluggish as all fuck. I would definitely recommend giving this at least at minimum a service, which is what it's booked in for. So, while it's on camera, I'm going to strip all this down and you'll see what I see as we go along. So it looks like a completely bog standard hop rubber and nub, nothing special with the hop unit either. Let's just check this barrel diameter internally. I'm guessing this is a 605, something like that, very much an old school stock barrel. It should be good to keep. We'll have to check what the FPS is coming out with on this gearbox when it's been rebuilt. Very much a standard motor here, it's just the classic army motor. Pretty much a dog shit motor, it's not going to do a great deal. Right, let's start with some of the internal components. Let's start with compression set, tappet plate, etc. So tappet plate spring is in good condition, that's good to keep. Tappet plate itself also quite fine to keep. Air nozzle, except for being incredibly loose fitting, will be the appropriate length for the hop unit and isn't damaged, so if budget is a concern, that's also fine to keep. Piston and piston head, I do not recommend we keep these. These are very bad, they're just shit, I'm not going to lie, mate. I'm not going to beat around the bush. It's a poor quality component, so we'll get rid of that and replace that for a decent one. So that's in the replace pile. This is the keep pile. So that side keep, that side replace. Cylinder head is in perfectly good condition. I highly recommend we do the AOE on this just because it's not obviously the greatest gearbox on earth. I think just correcting the angle of engagement on this won't do it any harm when we put the new piston in, and it'll just make it last a little bit longer. So I think we'll put an AOE pad on that. So this is in the keep pile, but we do need to apply an angle of engagement correction pad on that. It's just a soft rubber pad that I'm going to put on there instead of this current pad. And what that will do, it will help reduce the force on the front of the gearbox, the shock of the piston hitting, which will increase the longevity of the gearbox itself, and it will also correct the angle of engagement and just reduce the noise a little bit as well, so you know, every cloud. The cylinder itself doesn't appear to be damaged, however I will say will be a tad under volumed, so it depends on what weight BBs you'd like to run on this. We can probably get away with keeping this, to be perfectly honest. However, I will look in the spares box to see if there's one with a little bit more volume for when I correct the AOE. So I'll put this one in the replace pile. It's only a cheap component, so don't worry about that. Spring obviously is going to go straight in the replace pile. I never trust a stock spring because obviously by the time I've changed compression parts, this will be a completely different reading. And if, especially with a sealed gearbox like this where it's not got a quick change spring, if I can just pop in there, pop a spring in that I know is going to be roughly the correct FPS and I don't have to venture back in for a spring change, all the better. So that's going to be changed. Spring guide is a standard version 2 spring guide with a little nut that goes on the back. For the sake of, you know, a couple of quid, I'd probably recommend we change this form with ball bearings. They're not expensive, and it will be a nice basic upgrade that will help get the consistency of the rounds up much better, you know, shot to shot, because you've got ball bearings each side of the spring, and the idea is when the spring compresses, it's going to want to twist to keep its original shape. Now if you've not got ball bearings on each end of the spring, what it's going to do is twist and contort to make each shot slightly different in compression from this spring. So having ball bearings on at least one end and or both ends will certainly help alleviate that problem. So personally, I'd at least suggest a new piston head with bearings, or we can keep this one and the piston head with bearings will take the edge off, or you can go for both. It just depends, like I said again mate, it depends on how you're suited when it comes down to the quote, whether you're bothered about a few quid here or there, and how much you actually want to spend on this build. Moving over to components themselves, such as the gears, let's start with those. So move the upper shell out of the way, put this here. Sector gear, except for being covered in what I can only describe as, well, I'm not going to say it on camera, but you know what I mean, white sticky stuff, is in good condition, perfectly good to keep. The reason I'm spinning this in this little jig that I've got that holds gears is I can see if there's any twist or wobble in this gear from the axles, because if these gears have wobble in them, they're going to need replacing, but these are perfectly good so far. So sector gear is good. ARL catch is good to keep, the spring's fine on that. Okay, so this is your bevel gear. Now the bevel gear only has 2 anti-reversal catches on it. Even a cheap bevel gear set normally has at least 4. So I'll probably have a sift around in my spares box and see if we have one that'll match in with this current gear set nicely without causing any issues, and that'll only be a couple of quid just to upgrade it to that. Obviously one that's not damaged. I think this one might be slightly damaged, I'll have a look. It might be okay actually, but either way, as you can see, this one only has 2 ARL catches, this one has 4. The more you have of the ARL catches the better, so you can never really have too many. But I think for this, just because of budget, we'll try and stick to just a cheap replacement of the 4 as long as it meshes with the other gears. So the spur gear is perfectly straight, there's no issues with that at all, so both the sector and spur are good to keep. Like I said, the bevel gear I'd recommend we replace. Let's move on to the gearbox shell itself. Now the shell itself is a 6mm bushing hole gearbox shell. Obviously nothing proprietary going on in here, no little sneaky cracks or anything, so that's perfectly good to keep. Right, okay, so the bushings are perfectly good to keep, and they're a steel bushing by the look of it. I know they're covered in grease, but these are a mild steel bushing. Perfect for the job, excellent, perfectly good to keep. Inside of this gun there is a semi-auto cut-off lever that is looking a little bit worn, and the trigger contacts are looking fairly new. I'm guessing this gun hasn't had much use, especially not with a battery that's, you know, going to make it turn over at any rate of speed. So we've got a couple of options now. We've obviously got a needs replacing pile for sure, which is piston head, spring, possibly the spring guide if budget allocates for that, and cylinder. Oh, and not forgetting, I'm going to use that second-hand bevel gear there just to give you a better ARL catch pattern. The one thing I think we also need to replace is this, the motor. I really think it's going to be pointless putting this back in. It's such a shit motor. It's just, yeah. No matter how good a job I do inside of here, this motor's going to let it down. My recommendation will be use a second-hand motor that I've got knocking about, such as an old Cyma one that I've whipped out of a gearbox that's had an upgrade, and I've popped a Warhead motor tower on here because the stock motor towers from the old Cymas are shite. So at least this has a bearing, it's a little bit smoother, it's got a new pinion gear on it, so the bevel to pinion should sound good. It's also a high torque motor out the box. It's not the fastest motor, it's not the best, highest quality performance motor, but something like this is only going to cost 20 quid to upgrade over this absolute piece of shit motor, so, you know, it's a simple choice. Obviously I'll include this in the quote just so you know. In regards to the trigger contacts, now you don't have to keep these, it's completely fine if you want to get a shot of these and change it for a Perrin or something like that. However, I will specify this, I have a couple of MOSFETs spare that you can't adjust anything on but it is a MOSFET, so I'll be right back with one and we'll have a look. The Evolution Gear MOSFET. Now this is one I've whipped out of an old build. It's nothing special, it's nothing to write home about. I've absolutely no clue how good they are really as far as longevity is concerned. I've heard no complaints about them. They are very much just a stock MOSFET, the kind of MOSFET you'll get in any cheap gun out the box, especially the Evolution lines of guns. Not to be confused with the ASG Evo, these are their own brand of Evolution. However, it is rear wired. I can extend the cables, and this will get rid of the semi-auto cutoff problem, and I'll chuck you this in for a tenner. It's a cheap MOSFET, it's better than nothing. However, if I install this, you cannot install the brushless motor down the line. I don't know if you're bothered about that, but it's certainly something to consider, and it's, you know, a cheap and cheerful fix for a simple problem. Lovely, that is working quite fine. So, we could, if you want, install this for the sake of a tenner, and at least you know the trigger contacts aren't going to burn out over time. You're not going to lose the semi-auto, and it's just a cheap option. It's a quick fix, nice and simple. So anyway, to round off, what do we need to look at changing? What I'd recommend. It's entirely down to you if you want to keep this as simple as possible. But piston head, motor, spring guide, spring, cylinder, bevel. That should do it. And obviously the optional extra is nice cheap Evolution MOSFET that I've whipped out of a gun, just for an Evo M4, and change that out, and that will just help alleviate any reliability issues we might run into down the line. So, if that's all, I'll get this quote knocked up for you now, mate, and if you still want to, I can treat this as an hourly thing and give you basically no warranty with the hourly rate. That's how I tend to work with hourly things. Or I can put you in a quote for, you know, a fixed amount of time, and I can really dedicate some time into getting this build right. It's just down to your budget. Obviously as well, once after testing's done, we'll keep in the budget just in case, just a bit of cash spare for a hot rubber and nub at minimum. So that being that, I'll get this quote together and I'll speak to you soon. Cheers, dude.